Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the struggles you carry, the weakness in your body, the instability of your mind were never really yours to choose. That your life, long before you were born, had already been written into your veins by kings and queens desperate to preserve a myth. For centuries, Europe's most powerful dynasties believed their strength was not in their armies, their fortresses, or their faith, but in their blood. They guarded it jealously, built walls around it, and told themselves that purity meant power. But purity came with a cost, a terrible human cost. The story of royal inbreeding has been told in whispers, in dusty court records, in portraits of pale children with dark, heavy eyes. But to truly understand it, we must strip away the layers of pomp and ceremony and face a chilling truth. The crown itself was carried forward on the backs of broken bodies and haunted minds. For behind the glittering titles emperor, queen, archduchess, there were real men and women whose lives were little more than experiments in a dynasty's survival. The Habsburgs, perhaps more than any other family in Europe, became prisoners of their own ambition. Obsessed with keeping their empire intact, they turned marriage into a chess game where cousins were pawns, uncles wed nieces, and generation after generation was forced into unions that ignored biology in favor of politics. Over time, the family tree no longer branched outward, it folded back upon itself, tightening like a noose. The result was a dynasty that could command armies, dictate laws, and shape the fate of nations, yet could not protect its own children from the consequences of its choices. Some were born with jaws so distorted they could barely chew, others with fragile bodies that collapsed before adulthood, still others with minds clouded by melancholy, paranoia, or a madness that their courtiers called divine punishment, but which science now names genetic inevitability. And yet, this was not seen as tragedy by the courts of Europe, it was seen as sacrifice, a necessary offering to preserve bloodlines that were believed to be sacred. In their eyes, the suffering of a princess was worth the stability of an empire. The pain of a queen was a footnote in the survival of a dynasty. But history remembers differently. For when we look back not at the crowns or the treaties, but at the faces in the portraits, at the letters written in trembling hands, we see not myths or symbols, but people. People trapped in bodies they never asked for, carrying burdens that were passed down like a curse. This is their story, the story of how Europe's obsession with blood purity created not only kings and queens, but also prisoners in flesh and bone. The horrifying truth of royal bloodlines is not that they ruled, but that they suffered, and in their suffering they left behind a warning, one written not in ink, but in blood. For centuries, Europe's ruling families wrapped themselves in an idea so powerful it was almost sacred, that their blood was different from everyone else's. Commoners bled red, but royals, so they claimed, bled blue. It was not just a metaphor. It was a declaration that they were chosen, separate, closer to God than to the peasants who tilled their fields. The notion of blue blood was more than vanity. It was political armor. By insisting their lineage was superior, untouchable, even divine, monarchs justified their absolute rule. They convinced their subjects that obedience was not only loyalty to a ruler, but submission to destiny itself. Kings and queens became living symbols of an eternal order, their marriages acts of sacred preservation. But this obsession carried a hidden danger. To keep that blue blood unsullied, royal families closed themselves off from the world. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and children were born into a web of genetic traps. What began as a strategy to protect dynasties became a slow march toward their ruin. The Habsburgs were not alone in this. Across Europe, courts whispered about bloodlines as though they were holy relics. In France, Spain, Austria, and beyond, the myth of divine blood echoed in gilded palaces and cathedral halls. But nowhere did the idea sink its claws more deeply than in the House of Habsburg, where purity was guarded with a zeal that bordered on fanaticism. For those born into this myth, life was not privilege, it was prison. A princess was not a daughter, but a vessel. A prince was not a boy, but a continuation of blood. Their childhood games, their dreams, even their marriages were scripted by a belief that their worth began and ended with the blood in their veins. And as the centuries passed, the myth of blue blood revealed its price. That sacred lineage, once thought to elevate kings above men, began to cripple them instead. Fragile bodies, twisted jaws, clouded mindseas were not curses from God, but the consequences of human pride. The story of royal inbreeding is, at its heart, the story of a myth turned against its believers. The very thing monarchs clung to for survival became the slow undoing of their power, and in the end, the illusion of blue blood gave way to something far more tragic, the undeniable truth that nature cannot be bent to human ambition without exacting its toll. The Habsburg dynasty rose to power through strategy as much as through steel. They understood that kingdoms could be won not only on battlefields, but also at wedding altars. Marriages were their greatest weapon, alliances their armor. By binding themselves to nearly every royal family in Europe, they built an empire that stretched from Austria to Spain, from the Low Countries to the Americas. But this grand strategy came with a terrible price. To secure their hold on power, the Habsburgs married inward cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, a tightening circle of blood. They believed they were preserving divine purity. In truth, they were weaving a genetic trap that would one day ensnare their children. Historians trace the curse back to a single decision: the insistence that only Habsburg blood could sustain the dynasty's greatness. Each generation doubled down, convinced that one more carefully arranged marriage would strengthen the throne. But with every union, unseen cracks spread deeper. The results began to show in their children. Some were sickly from birth, their bodies fragile, their lives short. Others bore this strange, unmistakable mark of the dynasty, the protruding jaw, so distinct that it became known simply as the Habsburg chin. More than a physical quirk, it was a warning sign of something hidden in the blood. Yet, for the Habsburgs, the warning went unheeded. What mattered was not the health of the child, but the purity of the lineage. A princess was considered successful if her blood sealed a treaty, even if she died young. A prince was considered valuable if his name secured an alliance, even if he could barely walk or speak. By the 16th century, whispers of a curse followed the family wherever they ruled. Court physicians tried to explain away the illnesses, the deformities, the stillbirths. Priests spoke of divine punishment, but the truth was simpler and far more human. The dynasty was collapsing under the weight of its own choices. The Habsburg curse was not a spell, nor a judgment from heaven. It was a legacy written in flesh and bone, a reminder that power built on blood alone carries within it the seeds of destruction. It began as a quirk of appearance, almost unnoticeable at first, a slightly protruding jaw here, a misaligned bite there. But over generations, the feature became unmistakably an enormous jutting lower jaw that made eating, speaking, and even closing the mouth properly a struggle. This was the infamous Habsburg chin. Artists of the time, eager to flatter their royal patrons, often softened or disguised it in portraits, but the truth could not be hidden. Foreign ambassadors wrote of princes and princesses whose faces looked almost grotesque, their jaws jutting so far forward that words were slurred and food had to be pushed to the back of the throat just to swallow. Modern geneticists have studied the family line and found what was once only whispered. This wasn't coincidence. The Habsburg chin was the most visible sign of generations of inbreeding. Scientists call it mandibular prognathism, but in the courts of Europe, it became a symbol of the family's obsession with blood purity, a mark of their pride, and of their downfall. It was more than a cosmetic issue. The condition often came with speech difficulties, chronic pain, and severe dental problems. But for the Habsburgs, health was secondary to lineage. As long as the jaw carried royal blood, it was a badge of legitimacy. For ordinary families, such a genetic trait might have disappeared naturally over time. But within the tight loop of Habsburg marriages, it only deepened. With each generation, the chin grew longer, the bite more misaligned, until some members of the dynasty struggled with basic functions most people take for granted. The Habsburg chin became a metaphor for the dynasty itself, outwardly powerful, inwardly flawed, a face that projected strength but concealed suffering. Behind every royal portrait, every marble bust, every coin stamped with a Habsburg profile, lay the silent testimony of what happens when power is valued above human well-being. For the women of the Habsburg dynasty, marriage was never a matter of love. It was a contract, an arrangement inked in royal blood, designed to secure alliances, prevent wars, and keep power neatly within the family. From childhood, princesses were raised not as daughters, but as future bargaining chips. Their education focused less on curiosity or independence, and more on obedience, piety, and the ability to endure hardship without complaint. They were taught that their highest duty was to produce heirs, preferably sons, and to maintain the bloodline, no matter the cost to their own bodies. But these marriages carried invisible dangers. Cousins wed cousins, uncles wed nieces, and generation after generation, the same genes circled endlessly within the dynasty. The result was a silent storm of miscarriages, stillbirths, deformities, and genetic illness. Many of these women entered marriage with hope, believing perhaps desperately that their union might be different, that somehow, against the odds, their children would escape the family curse. But time and again, their hopes were crushed. For some queens, the torment was physical. Endless pregnancies ravaged their health, while grief from repeated losses drained their spirits. For others, the torment was social. A woman who failed to produce healthy heirs was whispered about at court, blamed for misfortune, and sometimes even cast aside. These queens were trapped in a cruel paradox, celebrated for their royal titles, yet reduced in worth to a single function: their wombs. Their individuality, intelligence, and humanity mattered little compared to their ability to perpetuate a bloodline already poisoned by its own history. And so, behind the glittering walls of palaces and the solemn grandeur of royal ceremonies, lay a hidden world of heartbreak, a world where queens suffered in silence, their lives sacrificed on the altar of dynasty. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna, the Mad. History remembers her as a queen who lost her mind, a woman unfit to rule, consumed by wild jealousy and uncontrollable grief. But behind the cruel nickname lies a story far more tragic and far more human. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the powerful monarchs who united Spain. From birth, she was destined to serve dynastic ambition. At just 16, she was sent away from her homeland to marry Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. To her subjects, it was a glorious match and alliance with one of Europe's richest dynasties. But for Joanna, it marked the beginning of a life defined by betrayal, isolation, and despair. Philip was handsome indeed, but he was also vain, selfish, and faithless. His endless infidelities tormented Joanna, who had been raised to believe that her worth lay in her marriage and her ability to produce heirs. Court gossip about his lovers cut deeply, and the more she protested, the more she was dismissed as irrational, hysterical, and mad. Was Joanna truly insane, or was she a victim of a system that sought to silence inconvenient women? Historians have long debated this question. Her symptoms, fits of weeping, violent jealousy, periods of withdrawal, could suggest mental illness, but they could also be the natural response of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, robbed of autonomy, and manipulated by the men around her. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, Joanna's grief overwhelmed her. She was said to have clung to his coffin, refusing to let him be buried, traveling across Castile with his embalmed body. Chroniclers seized on these tales as proof of her madness, but others suggest a darker truth, that these stories were exaggerated, even fabricated, by her father Ferdinand and later her son Charles V, both of whom had strong political motives to declare her insane. By keeping Joanna locked away, they secured power for themselves. In the end, Joanna spent nearly 50 years imprisoned in a convent, first as a grieving widow, later as a forgotten queen. She lived long enough to see her children ascend to thrones across Europe, yet she herself was denied the dignity of rule. Was she truly mad, or simply broken by grief and betrayal? The truth may never be known, but one thing is certain: Joanna of Castile was less a lunatic than a tragic symbol of how dynastic politics consumed women, stripping them of both power and identity. Her madness, whether real or manufactured, became the excuse by which powerful men controlled her life and erased her voice. If Joanna of Castile's tragedy was to be branded mad, Maria Anna of Austria's was to be born fragile. From the moment she entered the world in 1635, her life bore the unmistakable stamp of the Habsburg inheritance. Maria Anna was the daughter of Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor, and Maria Anna of Spain. Like so many of her ancestors, she carried the unmistakable features of inbreeding, delicate, weak health, and a body that never quite matched the vibrancy of her mind. Her jaw was slightly misaligned, her stature small, her constitution fragile. To courtiers, she seemed destined to follow the same sorrowful path as so many Habsburg women before her, to be married off for politics, to endure pregnancies that might kill her, and to vanish into the background of history. But Maria Anna refused to be forgotten. Where her body failed her, her mind soared. From childhood, she showed an uncommon intelligence and an insatiable hunger for learning. She immersed herself in philosophy, theology, and the arts, surprising her tutors with both the depth of her questions and the sharpness of her memory. In an age when most royal women were trained only in piety and etiquette, Maria Anna sought knowledge and found freedom in it. Her frail health often confined her to her chambers, but she transformed this limitation into an opportunity. Books became her companions, and ideas her escape. Two contemporaries. She was a curiosity, a princess who preferred study to courtly intrigue, prayer to parties. Yet within those pages she found a form of liberation that her broken body and restrictive court life could not give her. When she was eventually married to Philip IV of Spain, she entered a court drowning in decadence and political rot. Like so many Habsburg brides, she was seen not as a woman but as a vessel for children, a tool to preserve the dynasty. Yet Maria Anna brought with her something unexpected, an intellectual seriousness that lent her dignity, even as her health declined. She bore children, but tragedy followed, many of them sickly, others lost in infancy. Each loss seemed to confirm the curse of her bloodline. And yet, through it all, she carried herself with quiet resilience, retreating into her books, her faith, and her thoughts when her body betrayed her. Maria Anna's story is not as dramatic as Joanna's, nor as infamous as Marie Antoinette's, but it is no less profound. She represents the quiet tragedy of countless Habsburg women, brilliant minds and noble spirits imprisoned in frail, flawed bodies, sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. Her life reminds us that resilience does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers from the margins of history, in the form of a young woman who chose learning when the world expected only obedience, who found freedom in the only place she could, in the boundless realm of the mind. If Maria Anna of Austria represents the fragile scholar, her daughter Margaret Teresa of Spain embodies the tragedy of innocence sacrificed. Born in 1651, Margaret entered the world already burdened with the weight of dynastic expectation. Her father, Philip IV of Spain, saw her less as a child and more as a key piece in the Habsburg chessboard. From the start, Margaret was adored for her beauty. Her golden hair, delicate face, and innocent expression made her the darling of the Spanish court. Artists captured her image, most famously Diego Velázquez in Las Menonisium, mortalizing her as the very picture of Habsburg grace. But behind the portraits lay a darker truth. Margaret's destiny had already been decided long. Before she learned to speak, she was betrothed almost from birth to her uncle, Leopold I of Austria. This marriage, uncle to niece, was not unusual in the Habsburg world, where bloodlines mattered more than morality or health. To contemporaries, it seemed logical. The match would keep the dynasty strong, pure, and politically secure. To Margaret, it meant that childhood would end almost as soon as it began. At just 15, she was sent away from Spain to Vienna, where her marriage to Leopold was celebrated with splendor. Courtiers admired the sight of the golden-haired princess beside her somber uncle-husband, praising the union as a triumph of dynastic strategy. But behind the glitter of court festivities, Margaret's life was already slipping into tragedy. Her body, like so many Habsburg women before her, was frail. Yet she was pressed into producing heirs immediately. Pregnancy followed pregnancy, with little time for her young body to recover. Out of the children she bore, only one survived infancy. The toll was devastating. Margaret's health collapsed. Under the strain, she died at just 21 years old, still barely more than a girl. The brilliant promise of her youth, her beauty, and her innocence had been consumed by the relentless demands of a dynasty obsessed with its own survival. The tragedy of Margaret Teresa is often hidden by her famous portrait in Las Meninas. She gazes out at us, forever frozen as a child, forever innocent. But history reminds us that she was not spared the fate of her bloodline. The smiling girl in the painting became the exhausted young woman in Vienna. sacrificed to preserve a dynasty that was already crumbling under the weight of its own inbreeding. Margaret's story is a reminder that behind the political marriages and painted canvases were real human beings, children whose lives were traded like currency, brides who never had the chance to be women, and daughters whose value was measured only in heirs. Her brief, tragic life stands as one of the clearest examples of how the Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity consumed its own children. If Margaret Theresa's short life ended in exhaustion, her Aunt Anna of Austria offers a different kind of story, one of survival, endurance, and faith in the midst of physical frailty. Born in 1601, Anna was destined for a role that would once again intertwine family ties and political alliances. Anna was married to King Louis XIII of France, uniting the powerful houses of Spain and France. Like so many Habsburg women, she entered marriage not as a bride of choice, but as a living treaty. Her new life in the French court was far from easy. French courtiers regarded her with suspicion, seeing in her the Spanish princess whose loyalty to her homeland might outweigh her devotion to France. Anna's marriage to Louis was cold and strained. For years, she struggled to conceive a failure that left her vulnerable to whispers and ridicule in a court obsessed with producing heirs. Her position grew precarious, as rivals at court accused her of conspiracies and disloyalty. Yet, unlike many of her Habsburg cousins, Anna eventually succeeded where others had failed. In 1638, after more than 2 decades of marriage, she gave birth to a son, Louis Dudon, later crowned Louis XIV, the Sun King. This miraculous birth, coming so late and against all odds, transformed her reputation. The child was seen as a divine gift, a sign that God had smiled upon France. Anna's survival and endurance set her apart. While many Habsburg women were crushed by the weight of expectation, she leaned on her deep Catholic faith to sustain her. After her husband's death, Anna even served as regent for her young son, guiding France through a turbulent political landscape. But even in her relative success, the shadow of fragility lingered. Anna's health was never strong, and the anxieties of her position left her worn and weary. The very bloodline that gave her a crown also gave her a body prone to weakness. Her story is one of quiet resilience, a woman who, despite her isolation and frailty, found strength and faith, and left a mark on history through her son, who would become one of the most famous monarchs in Europe. Anna's life reminds us that survival itself can be an act of defiance. Where others broke under the strain of dynasty, she endured, carving out dignity and influence within a system designed to consume her. If Anna of Austria represented faith and resilience, Marie Antoinette embodied the tragic glamour of the dynasty's final chapter in France. Born in 1755 as an Austrian archduchess, she was married at just 14 to the future Louis XVI of France, once again sealing an alliance between Habsburg Austria and Bourbon France. From the moment she arrived in Versailles, Marie Antoinette was scrutinized. To the French, she was always the Austrian, a foreign queen whose loyalties were suspect. At court, every gesture was watched, every misstep magnified, where her Habsburg ancestors had suffered in silence. She faced the modern cruelty of public opinion pamphlets, gossip, and satire that painted her as wasteful, immoral, and detached from the suffering of ordinary people. Her personal struggles echoed those of generations of Habsburg women. For years, she failed to produce an heir, leaving her vulnerable to ridicule and political pressure. Eventually, she bore 4 children, But even motherhood could not soften her image in the eyes of her critics. The children themselves were died young, reminders of the dynasty's lingering genetic and emotional burdens. Unlike earlier Habsburg queens, who endured quietly, Marie Antoinette became a symbol of her dynasty's decline. Her extravagance at Versailles, whether exaggerated or real, stood in stark contrast to the hunger and poverty outside the palace gates, where her great-aunts and cousins had suffered hidden miscarriages and silent despair. She became a lightning rod for the rage of a nation. Her downfall was swift and brutal. During the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette was stripped of her crown, imprisoned, and eventually executed by guillotine in 1793. In her last moments, she displayed a dignity that echoed the resilience of her Habsburg ancestors, facing death with courage and composure. Marie Antoinette's tragedy was not just personal, it was symbolic. She was the last Habsburg Queen of France, the final product of centuries of dynastic marriages that sought to preserve bloodlines and cement alliances. Her death marked not only the end of her own life, but also the end of an era when Habsburg women could be used as pawns in Europe's grand political games. Her story ties together the themes of this entire history: the crushing expectations placed on royal women, the genetic fragility passed down through generations, and the way individual lives were sacrificed to uphold dynastic ambition. Marie Antoinette's name has become synonymous with decadence, but beneath the legend was a young woman caught in the same trap as her ancestors, valued not for who she was, but for what she represented. Not all the Habsburg women became queens, and not all left a mark in history books. Many were born into the dynasty only to vanish from it almost as quickly. Infantas and princesses whose names barely survive in records, whose lives were overshadowed by illness, frailty, or early death. These forgotten daughters were the quiet casualties of the dynasty's obsession with purity. Unlike their more famous sisters or cousins, they were not immortalized in portraits or political treaties. Instead, their stories were often reduced to a line in a baptismal record or a solemn funeral entry. One after another, Habsburg girls were born with frail bodies, twisted spines, weak lungs, or other signs of genetic fragility. Many died before reaching adulthood. Others survived only long enough to be promised in marriage alliances that never materialized, because their health failed before the vows could be taken. These children were mourned, not so much as individuals, but as lost opportunities. Each infant daughter who died young represented a broken alliance, a failed strategy, another reminder that the dynasty's bloodline was weakening. For their mothers, it was an endless cycle of pregnancies, miscarriages, and funerals. A private grief turned into a public crisis. If portraits survive, they often show stiff, solemn little girls dressed in adult clothes, their large dark eyes staring out with an unsettling awareness. It is as though even in childhood, they understood the burden of the dynasty's curse. The forgotten infantas remind us of the human cost that rarely makes it into political histories. While kings fought wars and diplomats negotiated treaties, these fragile girls paid the ultimate price for decisions they never had a chance to influence. They did not live long enough to leave behind great legacies, yet their short lives carried meaning. Each one was a link in the long chain of suffering that defined the Habsburg experiment in bloodline preservation. Their absence speaks as loudly as the presence of queens like Joanna, Margaret, Teresa, Anna, or Marie Antoinette. In remembering them, We acknowledge that the tragedy of the Habsburgs was not confined to a few famous women. It was systemic, woven into the very fabric of the dynasty's existence, cutting down daughters before they had even begun to live. If the suffering of the Habsburg women revealed the cost of inbreeding, the figure of Charles II of Spain made that cost undeniable. Born in 1661, Charles came into the world as the ultimate expression of the dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity and its genetic downfall. From infancy, he was marked by frailty. His body was weak, his health constantly precarious. He struggled to walk, struggled to speak, and struggled to learn. His face carried the unmistakable Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that he could hardly chew food properly. To courtiers and subjects alike, Charles was not a symbol of royal strength, but of a dynasty unraveling. Despite his condition, Charles was crowned king as a child, inheriting an empire that stretched from Spain to the Americas. But he was never truly able to rule. His ministers and regents governed in his name while he drifted through life in ill health, more an emblem of decline than a sovereign. What the dynasty needed from him, above all else, was an heir. Yet this was the one duty Charles could not fulfill. He was impotent and possibly infertile, rendering marriage alliances meaningless. His two marriages to Maria Louisa of Orleans, and later to Mariana of Neuburg, produced no children. Each passing year without an heir pushed Spain closer to crisis. By the end of the 17th century, it was clear that Charles was the last of his line. His death in 1700, at just 38 years old, marked the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. With no direct heir, Europe was thrown into turmoil, and the War of Spanish Succession erupted, a conflict that would reshape the continent. Charles, too, was not just a tragic individual, but the living embodiment of centuries of choices made in royal marriage chambers. His broken body and childless reign were the visible consequences of a genetic experiment gone too far. His death closed one chapter of history, but opened another. For the courts of Europe, it was the final, irrefutable lesson. Inbreeding could no longer be the foundation of dynastic survival. The death of Charles II in 1700 did not only end the Spanish Habsburg line, it ignited one of the largest and bloodiest wars Europe had ever seen. The question of who would inherit Spain's vast empire, stretching from the Americas to Italy and the Low Countries, became a matter of survival for Europe's great powers. Charles's will had named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. If France and Spain united under one dynasty, it would create a superpower capable of dominating the continent. For England, the Dutch Republic, and the Austrian Habsburgs, this was unacceptable. Balance of power, the fragile system that kept Europe from falling under one empire's control, was at stake. Thus began the War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. Armies clashed across Europe, from Flanders to Italy, while naval battles raged in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. The conflict was not just about territory, it was about the survival of dynasties, the shifting alliances of monarchs, and the future map of Europe. The war dragged on for more than a decade, consuming resources and lives on a massive scale. Cities were besieged, entire regions devastated, and soldiers marched endlessly under banners of kings who claimed legitimacy to the Spanish throne. In the end, compromise prevailed. Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain, but only on the condition that France and Spain would never unite under one crown. The Austrian Habsburgs gained territories in Italy and the Netherlands, while Britain expanded its naval power and overseas trade. The war settled dynastic rivalries for a time, but it also revealed a new reality. Europe could no longer be ruled by bloodlines alone. The age of dynastic supremacy was waning, replaced by the rise of nations, economies, and new ideas of sovereignty. The War of Spanish Succession was the final echo of the genetic gamble that had doomed the Spanish Habsburgs. Charles II's broken body had set in motion a conflict that reshaped the continent and signaled the end of an era when blood purity mattered more than human survival. The extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line forced Europe to confront a grim reality. The obsession with preserving pure bloodlines had come at a terrible price. Centuries of cousin marriages and close kinship unions had left a dynasty broken, its heirs frail, infertile, and often incapable of ruling. But change came slowly. Even after Charles II's death, cousin marriages did not disappear overnight. Across Europe, royal courts still valued the political security that dynastic unions promised. Alliances forged through blood seemed safer than treaties signed on paper. The fear of foreign influence and the desire to keep wealth within families remained powerful motives, yet the tragedy of the Habsburgs could not be ignored. Physicians, chroniclers, and even ordinary courtiers saw the disastrous effects of inbreeding. Slowly, awareness grew that marriages between close relatives carried risks not just of fragile heirs, but of dynasties collapsing altogether. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the pattern shifted. Royal marriages were still arranged, but spouses were chosen from further branches of European nobility rather than immediate cousins. Courts began to value fresh blood as a safeguard for dynastic survival. Still, the lesson was unevenly applied. In smaller kingdoms and isolated aristocratic circles, cousin marriages continued for generations. The scientific understanding of genetics had not yet developed. So many rulers still believed misfortune was caused by divine punishment rather than hereditary weakness. The story of the Habsburgs was thus both warning and paradox. While their decline exposed the dangers of inbreeding, it also showed how deeply tradition and power resisted change. It would take centuries, and the rise of modern science, for Europe to fully grasp the genetic truth hidden in their tragedy. The slow end of royal inbreeding marked not just a shift in dynastic strategy, but the beginning of a broader realization. The health of a family, a nation, or even a continent could not be secured by blood purity. Diversity once feared was becoming a necessity. Throughout this history, kings and emperors may have carried the crowns, but it was the women of the Habsburg dynasty who bore the heaviest burdens. Their bodies became the battlefield where politics, tradition, and biology collided. For Maria Anna of Austria, it was a life of physical frailty, her curved spine and stunted growth, visible proof of the dynasty's decline. For Joanna of Castile, it was the torment of a mind trapped between passion and despair, her madness both feared and exploited by those who sought power through her. For Margaret, Teresa, child bride and empress, it was the slow agony of repeated pregnancies that consumed her young life. For Anna of Austria, it was the pious endurance of a queen whose faith was her only comfort in a marriage haunted by sickness. For Marie Antoinette, though centuries later, it was the crushing expectation to bear heirs at any cost. Reminder that the curse of royal reproduction was not confined to the Habsburgs alone. And beyond the famous names were the forgotten infantista, daughters who died young, the mothers who never recovered from childbirth, The women whose stories were never recorded in detail because their worth was measured only by their WOMBS. These women were not architects of empire, but victims of it. Their value in the eyes of their families and courts was reduced to one role: to produce healthy heirs. When they failed, they were pitied, shamed, or cast aside. When they succeeded, it often came at the cost of their own health or even their lives. Their tragedies reveal something larger than genetics. They expose how political systems can dehumanize, how women throughout history have been treated as instruments of dynastic survival rather than individuals with dignity, desires, and dreams. By remembering their names and their suffering, we restore a measure of humanity to lives once overshadowed by the cold logic of bloodlines. These were not just queens and princesses, they were daughters, wives, mothers, and women whose humanity deserves to be seen beyond the shadow of their family curse. The story of the Habsburgs does not end with sorrow alone. Out of their pain emerged an unexpected legacy, one that reshaped the way humanity understands itself. When Charles II of Spain died in 1700, the dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own genetic fragility. But centuries later, historians, doctors, and scientists began piecing together the medical puzzle hidden within court documents, portraits, and autopsy reports. The strange jaw, the constant miscarriages, the mental decline, these were not signs of divine punishment, but of recessive genes exposed by relentless inbreeding. It was through tragedies like those of the Habsburgs that medicine and science gained crucial insights. The patterns of inherited traits, once dismissed as curses or fate, became the foundation of a new field, genetics. By studying how traits passed from one generation to the next, scientists like Gregor Mendel, himself a subject of the Habsburg Empire, revealed the laws of heredity. The suffering of these royal families, carefully recorded by courts obsessed with lineage, gave researchers a unique case study. Generations of intermarriage, documented with precision, created a living experiment in human inheritance, one that demonstrated with brutal clarity why genetic diversity is essential for health. This was the unintended gift of their suffering, proof that human survival depends not on purity of blood, but on its mixing. The Habsburgs became a cautionary tale, a warning that tradition without science can lead to ruin. Today, modern genetics carries forward lessons paid for in royal blood. From understanding hereditary diseases to shaping medical treatments, the science that grew from these tragedies continues to save lives. What was once a dynasty's curse became humanity's knowledge. Though the Habsburg dynasty collapsed centuries ago, the forces that created their suffering are not confined to history books. The same tension between tradition and health, between cultural preservation and human well-being, still echoes in our world today. Across the globe, isolated communities continue to practice cousin marriage. In rural villages, mountain valleys, or tightly bound religious groups, the logic is often the same as it was for royalty: keeping property, culture, or faith within the family. But the genetic risks remain unchanged. Children born in these communities are more likely to inherit rare diseases, developmental delays, or physical deformities. The lesson of the Habsburgs should serve as a warning, yet the pattern persists. Even now, doctors in certain regions treat patients whose conditions can be traced back to generations of intermarriage. The tragedies are quieter than those in royal palaces, but they are no less real. Parents grieve for lost children, families carry the burden of hereditary illness, and individuals struggle with medical challenges that might have been avoided. At the heart of this is a profound human dilemma, the pull of tradition versus the promise of progress. Just as the Habsburgs believed they were protecting their dynasties by marrying within their bloodline, many today believe they are preserving identity, culture, or honor. But the cost is measured in human suffering. The story of the Habsburg women mothers who lost child after child, queens who endured miscarriages, daughters trapped by decisions made centuries before, reminds us what is truly at stake. To repeat their mistakes is not merely to ignore history, but to inflict preventable suffering on future generations. The curse of inbreeding has not vanished. It lingers, reshaped, in places where human beings are still treated as carriers of bloodlines rather than as individuals with dignity and rights. For the Habsburg women, life was never truly their own. They were not valued as daughters, wives, or individuals, but as vessels for dynastic survival. Their worth was measured in pregnancies. Their dignity weighed against the hope of producing a healthy heir. Each miscarriage, each stillbirth, each frail child was not seen as a personal tragedy but as a political crisis. Courts whispered advisors, schemed, and entire kingdoms trembled, while the women themselves bled, grieved, and suffered in silence. They were treated less as human beings and more as instruments of policy. A marriage contract could erase a young girl's future. A bloodline calculation could condemn her 2 years of illness and despair. Their pain was invisible in official records, reduced to phrases like "the queen has failed to bear an heir," or "the princess suffers from weak constitution." And this dehumanization was not confined to the palaces of Spain or Austria. Throughout history and continuing, even today women have been reduced to their reproductive capacity. In cultures across the world, a woman's value is still tied to motherhood, her worth measured by her ability to produce children. The Habsburg women's tragedy was extreme, but not unique. They stand as symbols of a broader injustice, the denial of women's humanity in the pursuit of political power, tradition, or cultural survival. Their silence echoes with a powerful warning when society sees women only as wombs. History repeats itself in suffering. The torment of the Habsburg women did not vanish into the silence of history. Their pain, meticulously documented in royal archives, autopsy reports, and the portraits that still stare back at us, became evidence unintentionally shaping the rise of modern science. Doctors and historians, centuries later, looked back at the strange deformities, the endless miscarriages, the mental decline, and recognized a pattern. What had once been seen as curses, divine punishment, or mysterious weakness was, in fact, the inheritance of recessive genes. The systematic inbreeding of the Habsburg dynasty created a case study unmatched in human history. From it, researchers learned why genetic diversity is not just desirable, but essential for survival. The tragedy of one of Europe's most powerful families became a foundational lesson in biology. Modern genetics our understanding of hereditary disease, the risks of cousin marriage, the importance of variation knows part of its progress to the suffering of these forgotten queens and princesses. Their lives became data, their deaths, discoveries. This does not justify the horror they endured, nor erase the injustice of their fates. But it does mean their agony had a consequence their tormentors never intended, the birth of knowledge that has saved millions of lives. Out of their silence, science found its voice. In the end, the Habsburg women leave us with more than a story of dynasties, power, and genetic decline. They leave us a moral reckoning. Their lives remind us of what happens when ideology is placed above humanity. When bloodlines matter more than well-being, when women are reduced to tools of politics, they carried the crushing weight of choices, made generations before them decisions that robbed them of health, love, and dignity. And yet, even in the midst of despair, they revealed something enduring about the human spirit. Maria Anna sought refuge in scholarship, turning her confinement into knowledge. Joanna of Castile clung to love, even when branded mad. Margaret Teresa faced her suffering with quiet dignity. Anna of Austria found strength in faith. Marie Antoinette met her death with courage that still haunts history. Their stories prove that even when reduced to pawns, women could not be stripped of their humanity today. Their legacy is twofold: tragic, because their suffering was preventable; redemptive, because their lives helped humanity learn lessons that protect countless others. They teach us that true nobility is not found in bloodlines or titles, but in recognizing our shared humanity. Their voices, though silenced by time, still echo. Remember us not as queens or princesses, but as women who deserved better. Learn from our suffering, so that no one else need bear the curse of keeping bloodlines pure.